Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the Lantern of the Lost, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Lantern in the Mist. The rain came down heavy and cold, forming halos around dimly glowing street lamps and reflecting like shattered glass upon the cobblestones. Father Brown pulled his coat tighter around him, the brim of his old hat dripping steadily. Each step along the narrow alley echoed softly, swallowed quickly by darkness. He had walked these streets many times, familiar with their hidden sorrows and secret sins, but tonight something felt different, sharper. The air was thick with a tension he could almost taste, a heavy fog swirling at the edge of visibility. Turning a corner, Father Brown passed the flickering red glow of a neon sign advertising drinks and distraction. Through a smudged window, he saw the patrons inside, huddled at tables or alone at the bar, seeking solace from the harsh night. He paused briefly, taking in the shadowy figures within, noting the weary eyes and hunched shoulders of desperate men. It was always the same, he thought. People looked outwardly strong, but inwardly broken. He had learned that sins were rarely bold or dramatic. They were quiet, lingering, hidden beneath smiles and silences. With a resigned sigh, he pressed onward, guided more by instinct than reason. Ahead, through the rolling mists, he spotted a familiar shape standing beneath a gas-lit lamppost. It was a woman, dark-haired, wrapped in a long trench coat, cigarette smoke drifting slowly upward into the drizzle. Her silhouette was sharp and angular, dangerous and inviting. Father Brown recognized her at once. Eleanor Blake was a woman who drifted through dark corners, her beauty and charm used as weapons rather than gifts. She turned slightly as he approached, eyes glittering coldly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her lips parted in a practiced smile, revealing no warmth. "Father," she murmured softly, her voice lilting with an edge of false innocence. "What a curious place for a man like you to wander." "The world is full of curious places," Father Brown replied mildly, stopping a few steps away, hands clasped calmly before him. "Though I admit this one is darker than most." She laughed softly, a velvet-edged sound that seemed to vanish into the mist. "You should be careful. Good men who wander in dark places often find trouble, or perhaps trouble finds them." He considered her thoughtfully, noting how carefully she had positioned herself in the half-light, showing him only as much as she wished him to see. "And yet, Miss Blake," he said quietly, "trouble often reveals truth. Perhaps that is why we find ourselves here together." Her eyes narrowed slightly, uncertainty flickering briefly before she caught herself. "There's a matter," she began cautiously, lowering her voice, glancing quickly around as if fearful the shadows might overhear. "One I hoped you might resolve quietly, without involving anyone unnecessary." Father Brown nodded slowly, the rain pattering softly around them. "Most sins prefer secrecy. What is it you would hide?" She glanced away, visibly uneasy, choosing her words carefully. "There's a man, Lucas Moretti. I'm certain you've heard of him. He's disappeared, and a certain valuable object vanished along with him. Many dangerous people are looking, Father, It would be unfortunate if someone innocent was hurt. He observed her carefully, sensing layers beneath her request, each darker than the last. Your concern for innocent lives is commendable, Eleanor, but tell me, are you worried about them or yourself? She met his steady gaze, tension crackling beneath her careful composure. Her voice grew tight. Lucas was involved with dangerous men, criminals, corrupt police. He took something from them. They'll stop at nothing. But if you find him first, Father, you might convince him to return it safely. They'll listen to you. Father Brown watched her face closely, knowing there was truth hidden beneath the veil of deceit. I wonder, he said quietly, what is truly valuable enough to risk one's soul for? She stiffened visibly, surprise flickering briefly before it faded behind her practiced mask. Just help me find him, Father, she whispered urgently, stepping closer. You could save more than one life tonight. He nodded slowly, as though weighing her words against some unseen scale of judgment. I'll find your man, he agreed softly. But remember this, Eleanor, sin always has a price, and truth will find us eventually. Leaving her beneath the lamppost, Father Brown moved deeper into the tangled streets of the city, guided now by whispers and memories. His steps carried him through places he rarely visited, streets choked with shadows and desperation. Men lurked in doorways, murmuring dark promises, and eyes glowed hungrily from windows obscured by grime and neglect. He passed a policeman on a corner, leaning against the wall, his hat tilted low, the telltale bulge of a bribe-filled pocket. The officer watched Father Brown pass with narrowed suspicion, seeing only a harmless priest out of place, a harmless lamb wandering foolishly into the wolves' den. Father Brown smiled faintly to himself, knowing appearances were often deceiving. In truth, the wolves rarely frightened him. They revealed themselves easily, their brutality blunt and straightforward. It was the sheep hiding sharpened fangs beneath their wool that truly troubled him. At last, he arrived at a weathered tenement. The bricks stained by soot and the passage of time. The building loomed ominously, the windows cracked and dark. He climbed creaking stairs, the wooden planks groaning protest beneath his steps, and knocked softly at a peeling door. When it swung open, he stood calmly before a tall, broad-shouldered man with suspicious eyes and restless hands, a gangster named Thomas Greer. Greer smirked mockingly, looking the priest up and down. Wrong address, Father, or are you lost? Neither, Father Brown said, softly, meeting his gaze steadily. I believe you know exactly why I'm here. Greer frowned slightly, stepping back, allowing him inside cautiously. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. Two other men lounged uneasily in the shadows, their narrowed eyes tracking Father Brown's every move. You're brave to come here, Greer remarked darkly. Priests who meddle don't always walk back out. I'm well aware, Father Brown replied calmly, but fear rarely guides my steps. Greer chuckled humorlessly. You're looking for Moretti. Why? Father Brown's voice remained soft, disarmingly gentle. He took something from you. A lantern, ornate, old, perhaps valuable, but the loss pains you deeply, and you do not know why. You believe it's mere greed, but perhaps your heart understands more clearly than your head. Greer flinched, anger sparking in his eyes. Careful, Father, he growled. Your collar won't stop me from teaching you some manners. Father Brown shook his head, quietly, unafraid. Your threats aren't necessary. You've already revealed more than you realize. Greer hesitated, anger wavering, uncertainty flickering through him. Speak plainly, he demanded roughly. The lantern is a symbol, Father Brown explained quietly, not merely a bauble. It carries memories, burdens, sins. Lucas stole it, yes, but not for profit. He intended it as leverage, a means of escaping his past. But the past can never truly be left behind. It follows us relentlessly. Greer's jaw tightened, voice harsh with restrained emotion. Enough riddles. Where is he? Father Brown regarded him sadly, compassionately. Moretti is gone, dead by your own hand, but not intentionally. In your rage you struck him. He fell, and you ran, leaving him lying cold beneath the bridge. Greer paled, eyes wide with disbelief. You can't know that, he breathed hoarsely. Father Brown met his gaze gently. Sin never remains hidden forever. We carry it in our hearts, visible to eyes, trained to see. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Greer sank into a chair, shoulders slumped in defeat. Father Brown stepped quietly forward, placing a gentle hand upon the man's shoulder. Confess your crime, he urged gently. Free yourself from guilt. Outside, as dawn slowly broke through the mist, Father Brown paused, feeling a quiet peace settle within him. Truth had pierced the darkness yet again, shining clearly even amidst shadows. He smiled faintly, walking slowly homeward, lanterns dimming as morning approached, the rain subsiding at last as the city began awakening to another day, a day where sins might yet be forgiven. Chapter 2. Shadows on Chapel Street. Rain fell like slow whispers against the cracked pavement of Chapel Street, washing away traces of the city's daylight sins, only to replace them with darker secrets in the night. Neon signs flickered restlessly through the haze, their garish reds and blues bleeding reflections onto puddles below. Father Brown moved quietly along the rain-slick sidewalk, his worn coat damp at the shoulders, the brim of his old hat shadowing gentle eyes accustomed to seeing things hidden deep within the gloom. He paused before the steps of St. Michael's, his modest chapel wedged incongruously between pawnshops and taverns, its steeple rising defiantly against the smoky, indifferent sky. Nearby, a group of shadowy figures drifted in and out of the alleyway, their murmurs quiet yet watchful. Father Brown knew their kind, souls who had found temporary shelter in shadows, fleeing something darker still. Yet tonight, their eyes seemed wary, hesitant even. Something had changed, unsettling even the streetwise into anxious murmurs and sideways glances. Father Brown felt the familiar weight of suspicion in the air, an almost tangible unease, as though the street itself feared what had occurred here. He stepped quietly through the chapel's side entrance, water dripping from his hat onto the worn stone floor, its echo softly breaking the silence. A single candle flickered beside the statue of St. Michael, its flame weak and trembling in the draught. A woman waited for him there, seated quietly in the front pew, her elegant coat damp at the shoulders. Her hair, a cascade of raven-black curls, framed a face hardened by experience, but still strikingly beautiful beneath the dim candlelight. She glanced up slowly as he approached, her eyes dark and calculating, shadowed by both fear and ambition. Father Brown recognized those eyes immediately. They belonged to Margaret Bellamy, a woman known across the city for her subtle but ruthless manipulation, as well as her uncanny ability to appear exactly where she was least expected. "Father," she began softly, her voice carrying the husky allure of someone accustomed to being listened to. "It's a dreadful night for Faith, isn't it?" "Perhaps," he replied gently, taking a seat across from her. "But Faith is most valuable precisely when tested by darkness. She smiled faintly, but it never touched her eyes. They say you understand sins better than most men. I've come because I need someone who understands. Sin, he studied her carefully, noting the slight tremor of her hands as she lit another cigarette, the smoke curling upward in ghostly tendrils. Her eyes were calm, but beneath lay the subtle urgency of someone desperate to hide vulnerability. "You may speak plainly, Miss Bellamy," Father Brown encouraged quietly. "Truth is easier spoken plainly, even if it is uncomfortable." She hesitated only a moment, taking a slow breath as if gathering courage. "It's about Edward Cartwright. You've met him, I think. Rich, arrogant, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. Last night, after an unpleasant confrontation at the Cardinal's Inn, he vanished. The police suspect foul play." Father Brown nodded slowly. "You fear something other than murder, don't you?" "I fear scandal," she admitted sharply, exhaling smoke through tight lips. Edward Bellamy was with Moretti's people, criminals who deal in whispers, blackmail, and worse. If Edward is discovered, the shame will ruin me. My reputation is all I have." He considered her thoughtfully, reading between the lines she tried so carefully to control. "Edward's sins trouble you greatly," he remarked quietly, "but perhaps they trouble you because they mirror your own." Her eyes narrowed slightly, the cigarette trembling for a moment before steadying again. "You presume too much, Father." "Perhaps," Father Brown agreed mildly, "but presumption often leads to clarity. Tell me, what was Edward doing on Chapel Street tonight?" She hesitated, only briefly. "Meeting a man named Vincent Greer, Thomas Greer's brother, I believe. They had business regarding a certain relic, something called the Lantern of the Lost. It vanished last night along with Edward." Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. "It appears lost things have a habit of pulling the righteous and the guilty into strange alliances." She narrowed her gaze, irritated. "Save your sermons for Sunday, Father. All I ask is that you find Edward quietly, before his mistakes become everyone's." Father Brown met her gaze calmly, recognizing fear beneath the anger. Fear of exposure, fear of judgment, fear of losing carefully maintained control. He inclined his head slightly, accepting her request without further debate. "I will find him," he promised quietly. "But remember, Miss Bellamy, what we hide in shadows often returns in unexpected ways." Father Brown stepped back into the rain, retracing his steps down Chapel Street, guided not by what Miss Bellamy had said, but by what she'd carefully left unspoken. Her silence was as revealing as confession, perhaps more so. The Lantern of the Lost, he recalled, had been the center of a theft weeks ago, a treasured relic stolen from St. Jude's Chapel, a priceless symbol steeped in legend. It had vanished along with Moretti, whose death was now rumored openly. It seemed this lantern cast longer shadows than mere theft, each secret uncovered only leading to more darkness. As he moved deeper into the night, Father Brown felt eyes upon him, watchful gazes concealed behind rain-slicked windows, dark alleys, and half-closed doors. Chapel Street had grown dangerous in recent weeks, riddled with whispers of corruption and betrayal. He knew that someone here held answers, though perhaps unwillingly. A priest, walking among shadows, might appear harmless, but Father Brown's presence was beginning to draw dangerous attention. A voice emerged suddenly from the gloom. "You've got nerve, Father." Vincent Greer's drawl sounded softly menacing. As the slender gangster stepped from an alleyway, his outline sharp beneath the streetlight. Behind him, Two other figures moved quietly into position, their intentions clearly sinister. "Bravery isn't required when one has faith," Father Brown replied serenely, his eyes studying Vincent's pale face, noting the nervous tension hidden beneath the bravado. "Though perhaps you have something you'd prefer to confess rather than threaten." Greer laughed softly, stepping closer, his hand twitching impatiently near the pocket of his coat. "Edward Bellamy got himself into trouble, and trouble, Father, has a nasty habit of spreading like disease. You should have stayed in church tonight." Father Brown shook his head calmly. "Trouble begins in the heart, not the street. What is it about Bellamy that frightens you so?" Greer's eyes flickered briefly with confusion. "Careful, Father," he warned coldly. "You don't know half of what you're meddling with." "True, Father," Brown admitted quietly, unflinching. "But I know the half that matters most. Greed, envy, pride, sins leave tracks deeper than blood." Greer hesitated, visibly thrown by Father Brown's calm certainty, glancing uneasily toward his companions emerging from shadows nearby. Men armed with violence in their eyes, prepared for action, awaiting only their leader's nod. Yet still, Father Brown stood unafraid, hands folded gently before him, eyes compassionate yet piercing. "Edward wanted out," Greer admitted finally, voice bitter. "Thought he could sell the lantern and vanish, but we don't let people vanish that easily." Father Brown tilted his head thoughtfully. "Perhaps because disappearing would have revealed something else. Something you'd rather keep hidden." Greer tensed, anger darkening his face. "Careful, priest," he warned again. "Not all shadows fade at sunrise." "No," Father Brown answered softly, voice serene, yet heavy with compassion. "Some linger, haunting even those who cast them. Tell me, where is Edward?" Greer sighed deeply, surrendering slowly to the quiet force of Father Brown's presence. "He's dead," Greer admitted bitterly. "I found him behind St. Jude's. Someone else got to him first. Someone who wanted that lantern even more." Father Brown's heart grew heavy with understanding. "The lantern symbolizes redemption," he explained softly, almost to himself. "But when twisted by greed, even redemption can turn deadly." Greer looked away bitterly. "Edward died for nothing. The lantern's worthless, just an old light. But people kill for less." Father Brown shook his head, saddened. "Not worthless, Vincent. It revealed exactly who you all are, the darkness within each of you." Greer looked away sharply, guilt flickering briefly in his eyes before being buried beneath anger. "Get out, Father. Leave before you become part of this darkness." Father Brown stepped back slowly, nodding slightly in compassion rather than fear. "I'll leave," he replied calmly. "But darkness, Vincent, isn't something outside ourselves. It lives wherever we refuse to let the truth shine." He left Chapel Street behind, retracing his steps through winding alleys until dawn began to break across rain-slick rooftops. The case wasn't closed. Perhaps it never fully would be, not entirely. Yet Father Brown knew that justice was not always found in punishment alone. Justice sometimes came quietly, borne by whispers of guilt and the burden of truth revealed. As dawn touched the rooftops of Chapel Street, shadows faded slowly away, but Father Brown knew too well they would return. Chapter 3. A Whisper from the Crypt. The rain trickled like icy whispers through the old city, sliding along cobblestones and pooling in alleyways that concealed dark secrets beneath their damp shadows. Neon lights cast weary halos through the fog, staining puddles scarlet and blue, colors fading like confessions half forgotten. Father Brown walked these streets often, his modest figure dwarfed beneath the heavy folds of a worn black coat, collar turned up against the chill. His steps were measured, calm, neither rushed nor hesitant, moving quietly through a world that respected neither quiet nor virtue. Chapel Street, that ancient thoroughfare of sin and salvation, stretched ahead of him. It was here, amid gambling dens and cheap taverns, that Father Brown's chapel stood as an island of refuge in an ocean of despair. He paused briefly, watching shadows ripple beneath the flickering glow of street lamps, aware that something more sinister than mere darkness lurked tonight. Whispered plea had reached him earlier that evening, delivered anonymously, yet weighted with desperation. It spoke of a missing man. Daniel Royce, a clerk at the city archives, vanished 3 nights ago. Whispers connected his disappearance to St. Jude's Chapel and its long-neglected crypt. Father Brown had never met Daniel Reeves personally, yet he knew the type: quiet, diligent, precise, and perhaps too inquisitive for his own good. Such men were easily forgotten, overlooked by the powerful, until they stumbled upon secrets better left buried. The priest stepped toward the chapel's side door, unlocking it quietly. Inside, the air held a chill, heavy with incense and dampness, lingering like the memories of sins confessed but never fully absolved. Waiting inside was a woman he had not expected, seated alone in the last pew, dressed elegantly in black, a delicate veil shadowing her face. Even from a distance, Father Brown recognized her instantly. Marion Blake, widow of a powerful gangster. Her reputation was as flawless as her carefully composed grief, yet her eyes betrayed something less genuine. Marion was adept at playing mournful innocence, a strategy she often employed to mask deeper motives. She rose slowly, approaching him with an almost exaggerated grace. "Father," she murmured, voice smooth but edged with manipulation rather than genuine sorrow, "I prayed you'd come." Father Brown smiled gently, unfazed by her practiced sincerity. "Prayer is always answered, Mrs. Blake, but perhaps not in ways we expect. Tell me, what draws you from mourning to mystery?" Marion tilted her head slightly, revealing a porcelain face barely touched by grief. "My husband left behind many debts, Father. Some debts aren't measured in dollars or power, but blood and silence. I've heard rumors Daniel Reeves discovered a ledger hidden in the crypt of St. Jude's, documents proving certain policemen's corruption, and worse." Father Brown raised an eyebrow gently. "Yet you fear these revelations, even as you seek them out." She gave a delicate sigh, practiced and artful. "Secrets, once uncovered, can burn more fiercely than any fire. Inspector Rowland and his men have protected these streets by darkness rather than law. They say Daniel vanished because he discovered too much. If those secrets surface, they'll consume everyone, even the innocent." Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. Marion's presence here was not simply about concern, but manipulation, guiding him toward truths others wished hidden. "You speak eloquently, Mrs. Blake, yet often those who fear the truth have already condemned themselves." Her eyes narrowed briefly behind the veil, surprise flickering before she regained composure. "Careful, Father. Wisdom like yours makes enemies as often as friends." He smiled gently, unperturbed. "Truth tends to upset both sinner and saint alike. But secrets are fragile things, Marion. Easy to bury, yet harder to keep buried. I shall visit the crypt myself. Perhaps Mr. Reeves still has something to say." Leaving Marion Blake seated in shadowed silence, Father Brown made his way toward St. Jude's Chapel, his modest footsteps echoing softly along the deserted street. The crypt beneath the chapel had lain untouched for years, a forgotten chamber beneath the city's consciousness. He sensed its pull tonight. Darkness and sin lingered there, mingled with dust and the faint scent of decay. Descending narrow stone steps into darkness, Father Brown lit a candle whose faint glow danced weakly upon ancient walls. Stone coffins lined each side, worn inscriptions bearing testimony to forgotten lives. Yet something caught his attention. One coffin lid slightly ajar, revealing darkness deeper than the crypt itself. Peering closer, he saw footprints leading away into shadows. A voice spoke from behind, harsh and mocking. "Priests rarely find answers lurking in graves, Father. Usually just ghosts." Father Brown turned slowly, meeting the gaze of Inspector Rowland, a man whose authority concealed a deeper corruption, whose badge gleamed coldly against darkness itself. Behind him stood two silent figures, dangerous men waiting patiently for violence, faces grim, eyes calculating. Daniel Reeves found himself out of his depth, Inspector Rowland drawled, stepping forward with practiced casualness, his voice edged with menace. "Some secrets are safer buried, Father. You should have stayed in the confessional. Sins down here aren't forgiven so easily." Father Brown regarded him quietly, candle flame flickering softly between them. "Sin is rarely hidden well, Inspector. No matter how deeply you bury it, the stench always rises. But perhaps you already know this." Rowland laughed softly, the sound hollow and humorless. "Threats from priests rarely trouble me, but meddling priests can vanish as easily as clerks." Daniel Reeves poked too deep, asked the wrong questions. He discovered documents, names, and dates, enough evidence to ruin men who prefer their sins forgotten. Sadly, Daniel won't speak again. Father Brown watched the inspector carefully, his quiet voice cutting through Rowland's arrogance like a knife through silk. Yet Daniel has already spoken, clearly even from beyond the grave. Sin, Inspector, has a curious habit of confession. Even now, your eyes betray guilt. Rowland hesitated, annoyance flickering briefly before giving way to anger. "Careful, Father. This crypt could easily have room for another." Father Brown shook his head gently, compassion mingling oddly with pity. "You've misunderstood, Inspector. Daniel Reeves is still alive, hidden not out of cowardice, but wisdom. He knew you'd come looking, knew that your fear would betray you. You see, Inspector, sin's greatest weakness is arrogance, believing yourself stronger than truth." Rowland froze, suddenly uncertain. "You lie," he hissed. "I saw him vanish. I buried him myself." Father Brown smiled sadly. "You buried a man, but not Daniel Reeves. He saw your corruption clearly enough to deceive you. Another man died, one whose identity Reeves borrowed to escape. Even now, Reeves waits patiently, ready to reveal what he found. Your sin has trapped you in shadows of your own making." The inspector's face contorted with anger and desperation. "No," he whispered hoarsely, voice cracking. "That's impossible." Father Brown stepped closer, candle flame casting gentle illumination. "Truth is rarely impossible, only uncomfortable. But discomfort brings redemption, Inspector, if you choose to accept it." Rowland glanced nervously at his accomplices, men who suddenly seemed less certain of their allegiance. The inspector's bravado dissolved rapidly into bitter realization. "You think your truth will protect you, priest? These streets belong to me, not your God." Father Brown met his gaze unflinchingly. The streets belong to neither of us. Inspector. They're haunted by sin and redemption alike. The only difference between us is recognition. I see my sins clearly enough to face them. Roland stumbled back, shocked into silence. The priest's calm conviction was stronger than any weapon, disarming, without violence. Leave, Roland muttered weakly, the arrogance drained from him, replaced by fear and confusion. Leave before I change my mind. Father Brown ascended from the crypt, candlelight trailing behind, shadows retreating quietly. Dawn began breaking over Chapel Street, its pale glow dissipating the mist and weakening neon lights. Daniel Reeves would surface soon, bringing justice rather than revenge, exposing corruption but seeking reconciliation. Father Brown knew that sin was the true enemy here, not Roland, nor the gangsters, nor even the city itself. Sin was the shadow everyone feared most. Yet Father Brown faced it unafraid, guided always by quiet wisdom, his weapon not bullets, but words, understanding, and the quiet courage of faith. Chapter 4. The Man Who Wasn't There. A thin mist hung low over the city, turning the gas lamps into pale, ghostly sentinels along empty streets slicked by perpetual rain. Father Brown walked quietly along the alley behind St. Michael's, his gentle footsteps swallowed by the whispers of falling water and the distant melancholy murmur of the city. Chapel Street lay sleeping uneasily, its darkness heavy, its secrets poised on the edge of discovery. Father Brown knew these streets intimately. He'd listened to confessions and seen through lies woven by those who believed themselves invisible. Tonight, the shadows seemed especially eager to speak, but their words were veiled by fear. A figure emerged slowly from beneath a flickering street lamp. A woman wrapped in an expensive fur coat, yet unable to hide the raw nervousness in her eyes. Her name was Grace Kendall, known widely as a beauty who moved among the city's wealthiest and darkest circles. Her pale skin seemed almost luminous against the blackness surrounding her, but Father Brown noticed immediately how her elegant composure trembled slightly beneath her mask of control. She spoke quietly, her voice soft, yet edged with a subtle menace. "I heard you're good at finding things that prefer to stay lost, Father." Father Brown met her eyes, calm, yet penetrating. "Sometimes," he said gently, "but people who hide things generally have something deeper they wish kept hidden. Do you truly want this lost thing found?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, irritation quickly masked by an artful smile. "I'm not here to discuss morality, Father Brown. There's a man named Malcolm Reeves. He disappeared 3 days ago, just vanished, as though the darkness itself swallowed him whole. No one claims to have seen him since, yet somehow he's managed to cause more trouble gone than he ever did present." Father Brown nodded slowly, noting her carefully chosen words. "A curious thing about people, Miss Kendall. They often become most present, precisely in their absence. But tell me, why is Malcolm Reeves so important to you?" She hesitated a heartbeat too long, her gaze sliding toward the rain-slick street before meeting his eyes once again. "Malcolm was no saint, Father, but he had information. Dangerous information about powerful people in this city. Information he hinted he'd trade or sell. Now everyone wants him found, and quickly. Unfortunately, most of those looking won't be gentle if they find him first." Father Brown watched her closely, considering the subtle shadows in her eyes. "Yet you're worried not for Malcolm's life, but rather what his return might cost you personally." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You're very perceptive, Father. perhaps a bit too perceptive. Father Brown smiled gently. Perhaps, Miss Reeves, you should be less concerned with finding Malcolm and more concerned with why you fear him. Sin, you see, is rarely private. It connects us all, a tangled web spun from choices we pretend don't matter. She stiffened, her gaze hardening briefly before melting into a soft, calculated sadness. I never feared Malcolm, Father, but there are others who did. Powerful people, men like Inspector Harrigan, who prefer silence over truth. Malcolm trusted you. He used to say priests could hear lies better than confessions. Find him, Father. If you don't, innocent blood may stain your conscience. Father Brown saw through the manipulation in her voice, yet recognized genuine fear behind it. He sighed softly, acknowledging her plea with a simple nod. I will find your man, Miss Reeves. But remember, truth can harm as much as it heals. The street outside had grown darker, colder, as if the night itself resented Father Brown's interference. Moving slowly through rain that now clung like fog, Father Brown followed the invisible threads Malcolm Reeves had left behind, threads woven through smoky taverns and rain-slicked alleys. In a place called the Rusted Anchor, he found Vincent Greer, nursing his drink, eyes bloodshot and wary. Vincent Greer, brother to the now imprisoned Thomas Greer, was no less dangerous than his sibling, his demeanor just as hard-edged and restless. Father Brown approached him quietly, ignoring suspicious glances from nearby tables. Evening, Vincent, he began gently. You look troubled. Perhaps you've lost something, or someone. Vincent Greer's eyes narrowed dangerously, his voice tight with suspicion. You priests always talk in riddles. It won't save, you hear? Father Brown remained unmoved, smiling gently. The missing Malcolm Reeves troubles you, doesn't it? And not because he's missing, but because you know precisely why he vanished. Vincent leaned forward, voice dropping to a low growl. Careful, Father. Some men don't take kindly to accusations. Father Brown met the man's hostility calmly. Accusations are unnecessary. I'm simply noting what you've already revealed. Malcolm threatened you. Or more accurately, he threatened what you protected. Vincent paused, caught off guard by the quiet priest's insight. His jaw tightened visibly, anger flickering briefly. Malcolm was meddling in things beyond his understanding. He talked too much and knew too little. Men like that tend to disappear. I had nothing to do with it. But you know who did, Father Brown observed gently. And you know why. You might silence Malcolm, but guilt isn't so easily quieted. Vincent stared, anger giving way to confusion and grudging respect. You talk like a man who sees inside men's hearts. Be careful. Hearts around here ain't pleasant viewing. Father Brown smiled slightly, unshaken. I've learned that beneath anger and cruelty lies fear, and beneath fear lies pain. Perhaps Malcolm's disappearance is merely a symptom of a deeper disease festering in Chapel Street. Vincent looked away, uneasy, suddenly wary of the priest's insight. He glanced toward a shadowed figure standing silently near the bar. A policeman, Detective Collins, his eyes cold, watching intently. Father Brown noticed the exchange, understanding instantly. Corruption had spread like rot through the city's veins, reaching even those sworn to uphold justice. Stepping back outside, Father Brown felt eyes trailing him. He moved deliberately, aware he was being followed. Two men emerged from an alleyway, their footsteps deliberate, their posture aggressively confident. One held a lead pipe, the other something hidden in his pocket. They closed in around him, shadows circling slowly like predators. "You're poking around dangerous corners, priest," one warned softly, menace dripping from each word. "Bad things happen to good men who don't know their limits." Father Brown stood quietly, his calm presence unsettling them. "Limits are fascinating things," he replied gently, "particularly those we place upon ourselves. You threaten violence to hide guilt, but violence itself is a weak defense." The men hesitated, glancing uncertainly at each other, momentarily disarmed. Father Brown continued, his voice steady yet sympathetic. "You follow orders from Detective Collins, who believes Malcolm Reeves knows secrets about his corruption. But consider this. Silence may hide your crimes temporarily, but it cannot erase the truth you fear. Malcolm isn't your enemy. Your own consciences are." Confusion and anger flared across their faces, but they faltered, unsure how to respond to a man who spoke without fear or malice. They backed slowly into shadows, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving Father Brown standing alone in the rain, untouched yet deeply troubled. By dawn, whispers had led him beneath the chapel, down into the ancient crypts, where echoes of sins past lingered in shadows that candles could never fully banish. There, in the gloom beneath St. Jude's, he found Malcolm Reeves, hiding rather than vanished, his eyes wide with guilt and terror. Father Brown approached gently, voice soothing, compassionate. "Hiding never solves guilt, Malcolm. What did you steal?" Malcolm trembled slightly, shame creeping into his voice. "Documents. Proof Inspector Harrigan and Detective Collins have been protecting criminals, taking bribes. I wanted money, Father, but now everyone wants me dead." Father Brown nodded understandingly. "They fear exposure. But your fear, Malcolm, runs deeper. You've hidden these sins so long, you've forgotten why they matter." Malcolm swallowed hard, looking away. "I thought it was justice, but maybe it was revenge. They've ruined lives. They deserve punishment." Father Brown smiled sadly, shaking his head. "Justice isn't revenge. It's truth tempered by mercy. You vanished to hide your guilt, not their sins." Malcolm looked away bitterly, then sighed deeply, surrendering to the gentle truth of Father Brown's words. "Then help me face them, Father. Help me face what I've done." Father Brown placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, guiding him back toward the daylight, now breaking slowly over Chapel Street. The city would awaken soon, unaware of what had unfolded beneath its shadows, unaware how close darkness had come to consuming them all. Yet Father Brown understood. Sins committed in darkness always found their way into the light, revealing not merely crime, but truth. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Scarlet Confessional Rain fell steadily upon the narrow, crooked streets surrounding St. Michael's Chapel, coating cobblestones in a sheen that shimmered crimson beneath flickering neon signs. The wet pavement mirrored the distorted reflections of weary souls drifting through shadows, some seeking solace in bars clouded with tobacco smoke, others in darker alleyways offering only danger. Father Brown walked quietly through this tapestry of human despair, moving with the steady patience of a man accustomed to seeing past appearances into truths others would rather keep hidden. He turned into the alley beside the chapel, pausing briefly to look up at the darkened stone facade. The scarlet glow from a nearby tavern sign bathed the chapel in an ominous light, turning stained glass windows into red-tinged eyes, watching impassively from above. Father Brown sighed gently, sensing that trouble, as it so often did, had found its way to his doorstep. Inside, the dim chapel was silent, empty, save for a few guttering candles and a single figure kneeling quietly before the altar. As Father Brown approached, she rose slowly, turning to face him. In the shifting candlelight, he recognized Grace Donovan, a woman whose elegance was known throughout the neighborhood, but whose motives remained shadowy at best. Her black dress and veil spoke of mourning, yet her eyes held none of grief's sincerity, only the wary calculation of one accustomed to manipulation. "Father," she began, voice soft yet edged with urgency, "I've waited for hours. I feared you wouldn't come." Father Brown regarded her carefully, his gentle eyes unreadable yet keenly observant. "I often find that those who truly seek salvation have little need for waiting. Yet you linger here in shadows, Miss Donovan. Perhaps salvation isn't what you seek at all." Grace's lips curved into a faint smile, brittle and brief. "You misunderstand, Father. I'm not here for confession. I'm here because of another's sin, someone who confided in you recently." Father Brown raised an eyebrow slightly, calmly studying the woman's carefully controlled demeanor. "The confessional is sealed by a sacred vow, Miss Donovan. Perhaps you forget priests are bound by silence." She shook her head impatiently, stepping closer, voice dropping lower still. "Then perhaps I should remind you of another silence, one kept by men who vanish suddenly, men who deal in secrets. My brother, Francis, disappeared 2 nights ago after speaking to you. He came to you seeking absolution, or so he claimed." Father Brown listened calmly, detecting beneath her words a tangled web of anger, fear, and desperation. "Your brother carried burdens heavier than secrets, Miss Donovan. And burdens, like sins, become harder to carry the longer they remain hidden." Francis knew this. Grace's eyes narrowed sharply, masking surprise with practiced efficiency. "You speak as though you know him, but you know nothing of our family or the powerful men we deal with." Father Brown's voice remained gentle but penetrating. "Yet you know enough of these powerful men to fear them." Francis tried to escape their grasp, but the chains binding him were of his own making, and yours, perhaps. You fear not only for his life, but your reputation. She stiffened visibly, lips tightening into a thin line. "Careful, Father," she warned quietly. "You presume much, but you should understand. Priests like you can vanish easily enough when meddling too deeply." Father Brown smiled faintly, utterly unruffled by her implied threat. "Perhaps. Yet vanishing never erases guilt, only delays its reckoning. I'll find your brother, Grace, but you may not like the truths that accompany him." Leaving Grace Donovan standing pale and shaken beneath the scarlet glow of the confessional, Father Brown stepped outside once more into the rainy night. The darkness seemed heavier now, as if aware of his purpose. He moved deliberately through the narrow streets, guided by whispers overheard in confessionals, piecing together fragments that hinted at Francis Donovan's fate. He found himself at the Rusted Anchor, a tavern known more for broken men than its cheap liquor. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive, air thick with smoke and muted desperation. Father Brown drew quiet, suspicious stares as he approached a corner booth where Inspector Rowland sat quietly drinking, eyes bloodshot, face weary but defiant. Rowland looked up sharply, surprise quickly replaced by hostility. "You've come far from your chapel, Father," Rowland remarked coldly. "Men here don't talk sins, they commit them." Father Brown smiled gently, slipping easily into the opposite seat, unconcerned by the dangerous eyes following him. Sin speaks clearly everywhere, Inspector, even without words. Yet tonight, I believe we must discuss your own. Roland's jaw tightened, anger flashing briefly. You're bold for a priest. Boldness gets men killed on these streets. Father Brown's voice remained soft, steady, with quiet authority. Yet cowardice kills more surely. Francis Donovan is missing, Inspector. You're frightened. Not of what happened to Francis, but of what his disappearance might uncover about you. Roland's knuckles whitened around his glass, voice dangerously low. You speak lies. Francis Donovan was a thief. He took something valuable from very powerful men, men who don't tolerate loss. Father Brown shook his head gently. Francis stole documents, proof of corruption involving your own precinct, bribes, protection money, crimes committed under your watchful eye. Yet he wasn't your real enemy, Inspector. Your enemy is guilt. Roland stared hard at Father Brown, eyes narrowed, voice bitter with defiance. Careful, priest. Your collar won't protect you forever. Protection isn't necessary, Father Brown replied softly, compassionately. The truth itself defends me. Francis Donovan discovered that corruption spreads not by greed alone, but by fear. You were a good man once, Roland, until fear turned you into another pawn in Chapel Street's shadows. Roland flinched visibly, shame warring briefly with rage. Enough, he hissed sharply, glancing nervously toward the bar, where two heavy-set men stood watching intently, clearly awaiting his order. Father Brown remained calmly seated, his expression untroubled, disarming in its sincerity. I won't fight you, Inspector, Father Brown said gently, unafraid, but consider this, silencing me, or Francis won't quiet the voice inside your conscience. It speaks louder than any witness, and it knows the truth. Roland stared at him, eyes widening slightly, anger draining slowly into bitter confusion. His shoulders slumped, as if suddenly bearing the full weight of his guilt. Donovan's alive, he admitted finally, voice hoarse with exhaustion. He's hiding beneath St. Michael's, beneath the chapel, in the old Scarlet Confessional. He took a ledger, evidence of bribes I've accepted, money I've buried deep beneath respectability. Father Brown nodded slowly, compassion mingling with understanding. The Scarlet Confessional, he murmured thoughtfully, red as sin itself, a fitting hiding place. Roland looked away bitterly. I'm finished, priest. Once that ledger surfaces, the city will know me for what I am. Yet redemption remains possible, Father Brown offered quietly. You fear exposure, but exposure can cleanse, not only condemn. Father Brown rose, quietly, leaving Roland sitting stunned beneath the weight of guilt. He returned to St. Michael's Chapel, descending again into its shadowy depths. The Scarlet Confessional stood dark and foreboding in the corner, its heavy curtain drawn tightly shut. He stepped forward, pulling back the cloth gently. Inside sat Francis Donovan, eyes hollow, exhausted. Father Brown offered a gentle, understanding smile. Hiding sins won't erase them, Francis. Are you prepared to face what you've discovered? Francis sighed heavily, nodding slowly. I took the ledger thinking I'd expose corruption, but all I revealed was my own greed. Forgive me, Father. Father Brown placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Forgiveness comes when we confess truth openly, Francis, not when we run from it. Come, let us face the light together. As dawn slowly broke across Chapel Street, the rain finally ceased, shadows retreating from the chapel as Father Brown stepped into daylight. The truth was uncovered, secrets exposed. not by fists or bullets, but by wisdom and quiet strength. For Father Brown knew sin thrived only in darkness and vanished, powerless, beneath the steady gaze of truth. Chapter 6. Echoes from a Darker Night. The night breathed a low, uneasy sigh across Chapel Street, rain sliding down gutters like tears on a sinner's cheek. Neon signs blinked restlessly through curtains of fog, casting dim, pulsing hues onto the slick cobblestones below. Father Brown moved softly through this gloom, his footsteps muffled, hat tilted against the relentless drizzle. He often found himself wandering these streets long after decent folk had locked their doors, seeking truths hidden beneath carefully constructed lies, listening to echoes that others preferred to ignore. Tonight, Chapel Street felt particularly troubled, whispering dark secrets from every shadow. A man named Henry Delaney had vanished a week ago, simply disappeared, without leaving a trace, as though the darkness itself had swallowed him whole. Father Brown knew Henry. He'd seen the young man often at St. Michael's, quietly sitting in a rear pew, his eyes heavy with unspoken burdens. When he vanished, the police showed little interest. Men disappeared frequently here, consumed by debts, sins, or rivalries. Yet Henry's disappearance was different. He'd left behind something unusual, a small silver cross, carefully placed on Father Brown's doorstep, a silent plea for help from the shadows. Father Brown now carried that small silver cross with him, turning it thoughtfully between gentle fingers, feeling the weight of someone else's secrets pressed deep into its smooth metal surface. Ahead of him, a single neon sign flickered above a basement tavern called the Devil's Due, casting scarlet light onto the wet sidewalk. He stepped down quietly into the smoky gloom, the heavy scent of cheap liquor and desperation thick in the air. Inside, shadowed figures clustered around chipped tables, murmuring low conversations, eyes shifting uneasily toward the priest as he passed. At the far corner sat Evelyn Winters, a woman with a carefully constructed reputation. Beauty, danger, and calculation intertwined like strands of silk. Her smile was thin, humorless, and never touched her cold, guarded eyes. Evelyn had summoned him here tonight, her words masked in urgency, but her intentions carefully veiled. "Father Brown," she murmured softly, voice smooth as velvet, yet edged with subtle menace. "Men of your kind rarely frequent places like this. Perhaps you've come seeking lost sheep?" "Indeed, Miss Winters," he replied gently, meeting her sharp gaze with calm curiosity. "Though I find lost sheep often conceal deeper wounds than simple misdirection. Henry Delaney vanished into a night much like this one. Perhaps you could tell me why you are so interested in his fate?" Her expression tightened briefly, a flicker of irritation quickly masked behind practiced grace. Henry owed debts he couldn't repay, debts not measured in coin, but in silence. He knew things best left buried, Father. Dangerous things. Men disappear when they speak truths the powerful prefer forgotten. Yet you fear his silence as much as his voice, Father Brown observed quietly, watching the subtle tightening of her jaw. Truth frightens not only the guilty, but those who pretend innocence. Her eyes narrowed sharply, voice dropping lower, edged with cold warning. "Be careful, Father. Chapel Street isn't kind to men who see too clearly. Priests can vanish just as easily as errand boys." Father Brown's gentle smile remained untouched by her threats, his eyes soft but penetrating. "You misunderstand. Seeing clearly isn't the danger. Pretending blindness is. I wonder what it is you wish me not to see, Miss Winters." She leaned back slightly, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "You'll find out soon enough, Father. some truths buried deeper than the dead. Father Brown left Evelyn Winters seated quietly in shadows, sensing her troubled gaze following him. Back outside, the rain had softened into a whispering drizzle, mist swirling silently around gas lamps that struggled weakly against the dark. As he walked, Father Brown felt the eyes upon him, cold, watchful gazes of men who thought him vulnerable, easily threatened by fists or blades. They emerged from the alleyways ahead of him, faces half hidden beneath hats and scarves, eyes narrowed and cruel. "Evening, Father," one of the men drawled lazily, stepping forward with a dangerous smirk. "Late hour for holy business." Father Brown regarded him quietly, unfazed by their predatory stance. "Sin rarely sleeps, Mr. Doyle. Neither does guilt. Which troubles your conscience tonight?" Doyle's smile faltered briefly, confusion flickering in his eyes. He quickly masked it with renewed bravado. "You've been asking too many questions, priest. Henry Delaney knew better than that. Curiosity buried him. Now you seem eager to join him." Father Brown met the thug's gaze steadily, voice gentle, yet cutting through Doyle's false bravado like a surgeon's scalpel. "You misunderstand your own threats, Mr. Doyle. Killing Henry solved nothing, for your guilt remains as fresh as ever. You think violence buries truth, but in fact, it reveals it." Doyle hesitated, his fingers twitching nervously at his side. "Careful, priest. Talking clever won't stop a bullet." "No," Father Brown replied softly, "but neither will bullets stop truth. You fear what Henry uncovered, not just your crimes, but your sins. You silenced him out of fear, not strength." Doyle's eyes widened slightly, glancing uneasily at his companion, who shifted nervously. Father Brown saw fear creeping into their bravado, eroding it like water over stone. Doyle stepped back slowly, uncertainty edging his voice. "You know too much, Father. One day, your luck will run out." Father Brown shook his head gently. "Luck isn't my shield. Truth is. Go home, Mr. Doyle, and face your guilt. Henry's voice speaks clearly now, louder in your conscience than it ever could in life." The men retreated into darkness, their threats empty now, defeated by the priest's calm certainty. Father Brown continued his quiet journey, guided by the subtle echoes Henry had left behind. The night drew him to St. Jude's Chapel, its towering doors heavy with age, carved angels watching silently above. Beneath the chapel lay its crypt, a place where sins whispered more loudly than prayers, and where Henry Delaney's secrets awaited discovery. He descended carefully, lighting a small candle whose flame trembled softly, casting ghostly shadows on ancient stone walls. At the crypt's heart, he found what he had sought, a hidden niche opened in the stone, revealing a small, weathered book. Inside, faded ink revealed names, dates, and sums, evidence of corruption, blackmail, and murder carried out under the cover of darkness and authority. Among those names stood Evelyn Winters and Detective Inspector Rowland, whose deeds were etched clearly in the ledger's pages. "Henry's echoes speak clearly," Father Brown murmured softly to himself, sensing a presence behind him. Evelyn Winters emerged from shadows, eyes wide, breath shallow. "You found it," she whispered, voice trembling, desperation naked on her face. "But you can't reveal this, Father. You'd destroy us all." Father Brown faced her gently, sadness mingling with compassion. "You fear exposure, not because of punishment, but because of shame." Henry saw clearly. Yet he forgave you. He left the cross on my doorstep, as a plea for mercy, not justice. Evelyn trembled, tears beginning to trace silently down her pale cheeks. "He forgave me?" "Yes," Father Brown replied softly, "because he understood sin enslaves us all, whether we wield a gun or hide behind masks of respectability." Evelyn's shoulders shook with silent sobs, her carefully constructed facade dissolving into sorrowful acceptance. Father Brown placed a gentle hand upon her shoulder, leading her slowly toward daylight. Above them, dawn broke gently over Chapel Street, washing away shadows of fear and shame, leaving behind only the soft, quiet whispers of redemption. Chapter 7. The Woman in the Rain. The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets, turning the city into a blurred watercolor of neon light and shifting shadows. Chapel Street glistened under the downpour, its slick pavement reflecting the blinking red of the Blue Lantern bar sign, and the distant hum of street lamps struggling against the mist. Father Brown walked quietly through the storm, his old coat growing heavy on his shoulders, his steps patient and unhurried. A woman stood at the far end of the alley just beyond the reach of a failing gaslight. She was wrapped in a long, dark coat, her hat pulled low over her face, but even in the dim haze, there was something deliberate about her posture, something poised, like a question that had yet to be asked. Father Brown approached without hesitation, stopping just shy of the dripping awning that barely sheltered her. He took off his hat, shaking the rain from its brim. "Good evening, Miss Calloway," he said gently. She stiffened slightly. "You know who I am?" "Yes," he nodded, watching the way her fingers twitched inside her coat pocket, a nervous rhythm. "I've seen you in St. Michael's. Third pew, left side. You always leave before the final blessing." She exhaled sharply, the sound lost in the rain. "I never expected a priest to be so observant." "Priests must be," Father Brown said simply. "It is our job to notice when someone is seeking forgiveness, but too afraid to ask for it." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she pulled a folded paper from her coat and handed it to him. He opened it carefully, shielding it from the rain. The ink was smudged, the writing hurried. A name stood out: Jack Malone. Father Brown lifted his gaze. "Malone?" She nodded once, her eyes darting toward the street as if expecting someone to emerge from the mist. "He's missing. 3 nights now." Jack Malone was a name well known along Chapel Street. A gambler, a fixer, a man whose debts were paid in favors rather than money. If he had disappeared, it meant someone had called in a favor he couldn't pay. "Why come to me?" Father Brown asked. "Because you're the only man in this city who isn't looking for him to settle a score." The answer was honest, which made it rare. Father Brown folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his pocket. "Where was he last seen?" Her jaw tensed. "The Blue Lantern." Father Brown nodded and turned toward the neon glow flickering through the rain. "Then let us begin where the trail went cold." The bar was thick with the scent of damp cigarettes and stale whiskey. The patrons were hunched figures, nursing their drinks, the kind of men who had seen too much of the world and preferred to forget it. Father Brown moved through the room quietly, drawing wary glances from men who knew the collar but didn't trust the man wearing it. Behind the bar, polishing a glass with the same rag he'd been using for hours, stood Tommy Grayson. His suit was cheap but pressed, his face lined from a lifetime of keeping the wrong company. He looked up as Father Brown approached, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Father," he drawled, setting the glass down, "didn't take you for a whiskey man." "I'm here about Jack Malone," Father Brown said. The bar quieted, not fully, but enough that the weight of the questions settled over the room like cigarette smoke. Tommy's fingers tightened around the rag. Jack's a restless sort, probably ran off. Father Brown watched him carefully. Ran off. And yet, you hesitate before saying it, almost as if you don't believe it yourself. Tommy's jaw tensed. Listen, Father, this ain't the kind of place for your sort. Jack's gone. That's all you need to know. That, or you're afraid of who might be listening, Father Brown said gently, afraid of who might be watching even now. Tommy hesitated, then flicked his eyes toward a booth in the far corner. A single figure sat there, half hidden in the shadows, a cigarette burning between two fingers. Father Brown turned toward the man without needing to be told. He recognized the posture, the stillness, the quiet menace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of control. Detective James Holloway, corrupt, untouchable, and more dangerous than any of the criminals he pretended to hunt. Father Brown walked toward the table. The detective didn't look up. He took a long drag of his cigarette before exhaling slowly. You're asking the wrong questions, Father, Holloway murmured. Perhaps, Father Brown agreed, but asking the wrong questions often leads to the right ones. Holloway smirked, tapping ash into an empty glass. Jack Malone was a man who made a lot of mistakes. Some men don't get to make too many of those before they run out of luck. And yet, Father Brown said softly, this isn't about luck, is it? It's about Jack knowing something he shouldn't. Holloway finally met his gaze, and for the first time, the smirk wavered. Jack didn't run, Father Brown continued. He was taken, and not because of his debts, but because of what he overheard. Something that would expose the wrong people. People like you, perhaps. The bar was silent now, every man listening, pretending not to. Holloway leaned forward, his smile returning. But it was thinner now. Careful, Father. Men who dig too deep tend to find themselves buried. Father Brown met his gaze without flinching. Yes, he said softly. And yet, even buried things have a way of surfacing. Holloway's fingers tightened around his cigarette. You don't know what you're talking about. Jack Malone isn't dead, Father Brown said. He's being kept somewhere, hidden. Likely somewhere no one would think to look. Holloway stood up slowly, smoothing his coat. Go home, Father. Say your prayers. Father Brown smiled faintly. I always do. The detective stepped past him and out into the rain, disappearing into the night. Father Brown turned back toward the bar. Tommy was watching him, his face pale. You're crazy, Tommy whispered. You know that, right? Father Brown picked up an untouched glass of water from the counter, took a sip, and set it down gently. Crazy, he mused, or simply willing to listen to the whispers in the rain. By dawn, Jack Malone would be found, left outside St. Michael's, bruised but alive. The men who had taken him would never be seen again, and Detective Holloway, for the first time in years, would have reason to look over his shoulder. Because some sins, no matter how carefully buried, always find their way back to the surface. Chapter 8. Lies at Midnight. The city never really slept. It only changed disguises. By day, men in press suits strode along the avenues, speaking in measured tones, discussing figures, contracts, and the illusion of honesty. But by night, the same men let the mask slip, retreating to smoky bars and dimly lit rooms, where law was an afterthought and morality was simply an inconvenience. The rain had started again, the kind that made the pavement shine like polished glass, washing away the day's falsehoods, but leaving behind the ones too stubborn to be erased. Father Brown moved quietly along the sidewalk, his old coat dark with rain, his hat pulled low against the mist, curling through the alleyways. He knew this city better than most, not by its buildings or its streets, but by the weight of its sins. They sat heavy in the air, in the faces of the men who had long since traded their consciences for something more practical. He had received the note an hour ago, left folded beneath the battered wooden door of St. Michael's Chapel. No signature, just a time and a place. Midnight. The Black Orchid. The Black Orchid wasn't the sort of place a priest was expected to be, but then again, expectations had never concerned Father Brown much. He stepped through the heavy oak doors, into the hush of smoke, and whispered deals. The bar stretched along the far wall, tended by a man who polished glasses out of habit rather than necessity. The patrons were draped in shadow, their conversations spoken in careful half-truths. At a corner table, a woman sat alone. She was dressed in midnight blue, her gloves immaculate, her hat tilted just enough to conceal most of her expression. When she saw him, she gestured with a slight flick of her wrist, a movement too graceful to be casual. Father Brown approached, pulling out the chair opposite her. She studied him for a moment, her eyes calculating behind the cigarette smoke that curled from her lips. "You're not easy to summon," she murmured. Father Brown smiled slightly, setting his hands gently on the table. "Summoning has never been my specialty. I answer only to those who truly seek help." Her lips curved, but the amusement didn't reach her eyes. "That's what I'm looking for, Father." "Help, help," he echoed, studying the way her fingers twitched slightly against the cigarette holder. "Or absolution." She exhaled slowly, tapping ash into the tray beside her. "A man is dead." Father Brown nodded, unsurprised. "Men often are." Her expression darkened slightly. "This one shouldn't be. His name was Victor Moreau. He ran accounts for some of the city's less reputable figures. Last night, someone found him in his office with a bullet in his chest and a ledger missing from his safe." Father Brown watched her carefully. "And you believe I can help?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You see things other men don't. You understand people in ways they don't even understand themselves." Father Brown nodded slowly, tilting his head. "And what is it that you understand, Miss?" She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Eleanor," she said finally. "Eleanor Hayes." He smiled faintly. "That's a good name." She smirked. "It's not mine." Father Brown chuckled softly. "Names are curious things. People wear them like gloves, switching them when the fit no longer suits." She studied him carefully, then exhaled again, voice tight. "Victor had enemies, Father. But more importantly, he had secrets. That ledger, if it's found, could expose more than debts. It could bring down men who prefer to remain in the shadows." Father Brown nodded, his expression serene. "And you fear that in finding the truth, I might pull you into the light as well." Her jaw tensed slightly, but she didn't deny it. Before she could respond, a figure loomed beside the table. The man was broad-shouldered, his suit a little too tight across the chest, his expression the sort that came from years of enforcing things the hard way. His voice was slow and deliberate. "The ladies finished talking, Father." Father Brown glanced up at him, his calm gaze unshaken. "Are you sure? She seems to have quite a bit left to say." The man's fingers twitched, itching toward his coat pocket. "Leave." Eleanor sat very still, her posture perfect, but her hands were folded a little too tightly in her lap. Father Brown rose slowly, adjusting his coat. A man's life has been taken. That deserves more than silence. Enforcer's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You priests, always thinking words, fix things. Father Brown tilted his head slightly. Words don't fix things, but they reveal them, and that, I think, is what you're afraid of. For a moment, the air between them was heavy, tense, the bar holding its breath. Then the enforcer took a step back, his sneer returning. "Keep out of it, Father." Father Brown nodded slightly. "I'll try, but the truth has a habit of finding its way out, even when buried." He turned and walked toward the exit, feeling Eleanor's gaze on him, her expression unreadable. Outside, the rain had picked up again, thick and heavy. He pulled his coat tighter around him and started toward Victor Moreau's office. If the truth had been buried, he intended to unearth it. The office was on the second floor of a narrow building overlooking the docks. A single light flickered above the door, and the city's restless waters sloshed softly against the pilings below. Father Brown stepped inside, moving past the caution tape the police had left half-heartedly in place. The office smelled of old tobacco and desperation. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers pulled open in a hurry. Whoever had been here last had been looking for something specific. Father Brown moved carefully to the safe, its door ajar, empty, or nearly. A single slip of paper had been left behind, folded neatly as if whoever had taken the ledger had wanted someone to find it. Father Brown opened it. 3 words scrawled in haste: Midnight, St. Jude's. Father Brown exhaled softly, his breath misting in the cold air. Midnight was an hour away. He turned and left the office, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. St. Jude's Chapel stood at the edge of the city, its towering steeple lost in the fog. Father Brown arrived just before the hour, stepping into the quiet sanctuary where the scent of wax and stone filled the air. A figure stood near the altar, waiting. Eleanor. She turned as he approached, her expression unreadable. "You found the note," she murmured. "I did." She hesitated. "Then you know." Father Brown studied her for a long moment. "I know you were trying to lead me here, but the real question is, were you trying to protect me or trap me?" Her breath hitched slightly, her control faltering. "Victor was my brother." Father Brown nodded. "And you knew what was in the ledger, names of men who would have killed to keep it hidden." Her eyes darkened. "They already have." A sound echoed behind them. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Father Brown turned as Holloway stepped from the shadows, his gun resting lazily in his hand. "You should have stayed out of this, Father." Father Brown sighed. "Yes, I keep hearing that." Holloway's jaw tensed. "Where's the ledger?" Father Brown met his gaze, unflinching. "You already know. But the real problem isn't the ledger, is it? It's the guilt clawing at you, the truth you've spent too long trying." To silence, Holloway hesitated, just for a second. It was enough. Eleanor moved first, grabbing the gun, twisting his wrist hard. The weapon clattered to the floor. Holloway stumbled back, his face contorted with rage. Father Brown picked up the gun and handed it to Eleanor. "You have a choice," he said softly. "End it with violence or with justice." She swallowed hard, then dropped the gun. Holloway stared at it, then at them. Sirens wailed in the distance. Father Brown exhaled softly. "Lies never last forever, Detective." The truth, after all, had finally come calling. Chapter 9. The Sinner's Last Prayer. The city had a way of swallowing men whole. They walked its streets by day, convinced they owned it, but by night, the city reminded them otherwise. The neon lights flickered like dying stars, their reflections stretching long and distorted over the rain-slicked pavement. The gutters ran dark with things no one wanted to name, and the alleys whispered secrets to those who had ears to hear. Father Brown moved through the wet streets like a shadow, unnoticed by, for the same men did the same jobs, until he got greedy. Started keeping records, names, dates, payoffs, the kind of thing that makes powerful men nervous. He swallowed. He came to me one night, said he wanted out, said we could disappear together, take the ledger, sell it to the highest bidder, but I knew what would happen if we crossed the wrong people. Father Brown's voice was soft, but it cut like a scalpel. You chose survival over loyalty. Rourke nodded slowly. I gave them Benny. Set him up. He never saw it coming. His hands clenched. They didn't just kill him, Father. They made it slow. They made it a warning. His voice cracked. I heard him scream. Silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. The rain pattered against the stained glass windows, the city pressing in from all sides. They say we all get what's coming to us in the end, Rourke whispered. I think mine's here. Father Brown's voice was quiet, almost gentle. Who's hunting you? Rourke let out a bitter laugh. Take your pick. The men I work for think I know too much. Benny's sister. She never believed the story they fed her. And someone's been following me for days, a shadow, always just out of reach. His breath hitched. I can feel it closing in. Father Brown nodded thoughtfully. Sin has a way of doing that. Rourke looked at him sharply. You think this is about sin? The priest met his gaze steadily. Sin and crime often walk hand in hand, but it is not the crime that weighs on you. Samuel, it is the betrayal. You chose yourself over Benny, and now, whether by justice or vengeance, you believe the world has finally caught up to you. Rourke swallowed hard. You think confession will save me? Father Brown shook his head. Confession is not about escape. It is about truth, and truth has a way of setting men free, even if it is not in the way they expect. The doors of the church creaked open. A silhouette stood in the entrance, framed by the glow of a street lamp. Rourke's breath caught. That's him, he whispered. The shadow. Father Brown rose slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure. The man stepped inside, his movements unhurried, deliberate. As he moved into the light, his face became visible. Detective James Holloway. Holloway's smirk was a thin line of amusement. Evening, Father. Hope I'm not interrupting something holy. Father Brown remained still. Only a man's final reckoning, Detective. Holloway's gaze slid to Rourke, who had gone pale. Funny thing, Father. I've been looking for this man. His bosses want a word with him. So does Benny Leclerc's sister. But between you and me, I think she'd rather skip the conversation and go straight to the part with the bullets. Rourke's hands clenched. I told you, I don't have the ledger. Holloway chuckled. Oh, I know. But that doesn't really matter, does it? You handed over Benny, and now it's your turn. That's how this game works. Father Brown's voice was calm, steady. And if this is not a game, Holloway's smirk faltered slightly. Come again. The priest took a slow step forward. You believe yourself above these men, Holloway. You hold their secrets, you pull their strings. But corruption is a hungry thing. It devours even those who feed it. One day, the men you protect will decide you are no longer useful. Holloway's jaw tightened. You think you can talk your way out of this, Father? I think words are more dangerous than bullets, Father Brown said. And I think you know that better than anyone. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Holloway exhaled, shaking his head. You're a real piece of work, you know that. Father Brown said nothing. Holloway took a step back. Fine. Rourke's got until dawn. If he's still breathing by then, it's out of my hands. He turned and walked back into the rain. Rourke sagged against the pew, shaking. I can't run forever, Father. Father Brown looked at him. Number, but you can choose how it ends. Rourke swallowed. And if I choose wrong? The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. Then you pray, Samuel, and sometimes that is enough. The city outside waited, restless, hungry. But inside the chapel, for just a moment, there was silence. Chapter 10. Dawn breaks the lantern. The city was waking up, but it didn't rise with the innocence of morning. It dragged itself out of the gutters and alleyways, shaking off the sins of the night, pretending they hadn't happened. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick with memory, the neon lights flickering like dying stars against the pale glow of dawn. Father Brown walked through the hush of a city, pretending to be clean, his steps unhurried, his eyes calm, in a place where calm was often mistaken for weakness. A man had disappeared. That was how these things always began. This time, it was a man named Arthur Gable, a relic dealer with a habit of knowing too much, and a ledger filled with names that didn't want to be written down. The word on Chapel Street was that Arthur had been looking for something old, something valuable, something that made the wrong men nervous, and then one night he simply wasn't there anymore. Father Brown found himself at the Blue Lantern, a bar where desperation and whiskey mixed in equal measure. The sign outside flickered weakly, casting its ghostly glow onto the sidewalk where cigarette butts drowned in puddles. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the kind that stuck to a man's clothes and lingered in his lungs long after he'd left. Behind the bar stood a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of the night itself. Dark hair, darker eyes, and a smirk that never quite reached them. The kind of woman who could tell a man a lie so smooth he'd thank her for it. Father Brown, she murmured, without looking up from the glass she was polishing. Didn't take you for the drinking type. Father Brown set his hands on the counter, watching her carefully. I find myself in places where men confess things, Miss Hale, and bars are often more honest than churches. She chuckled, a dry, smoky sound. Maybe, but honesty's dangerous in a place like this. She set the glass down, finally meeting his gaze. You're looking for Arthur Gable. Father Brown nodded. I'd rather find him alive. She exhaled slowly, flicking ash from the cigarette she hadn't yet smoked. Arthur was a fool. He thought he could trade secrets like poker chips. Problem is, the house always wins. Father Brown studied her, noting the tension in her fingers, the way her eyes flickered toward the back of the room. And which house does Arthur owe? Her smirk faded. Depends who you ask. He had something, a relic, something old, something with a past. Father Brown nodded. The lantern. Miss Hale stiffened just slightly. So you do know. I know that men kill for things they don't understand, and I know that Arthur thought he had a bargaining chip. But he was playing with men who don't make deals. They make examples. She hesitated, glancing toward the back of the bar. If you keep asking questions, Father, you might end up like Arthur. Father Brown smiled faintly. Dead men don't frighten me, Miss Hale. But men who fear the truth, that's another story. She exhaled, shaking her head. You don't scare easy, do you? Fear is often a choice, Father Brown said, and I prefer curiosity. She studied him for a long moment, then slid a napkin across the counter, scrawled with a name. Try the warehouse on Dock Street. If Arthur's still breathing, that's where he'll be. Father Brown tucked the napkin into his coat and turned toward the door. Be careful, Father, she called after him. The men you're looking for don't believe in salvation. He paused, just for a moment. Then they fear the wrong things. The city stretched out before him, grey and silent in the early morning light. He moved through its veins like something foreign, something that didn't belong. At the docks, the warehouses loomed like empty cathedrals, places where men whispered in the dark and no one asked questions. The door to the warehouse was unlocked. That, more than anything, told Father Brown he was expected. Inside, the air was thick with dust and secrets, crates stacked high like forgotten confessions, and in the center of it all, tied to a chair, was Arthur Gable. His face was swollen, his lips split, but he was breathing. Father Brown, he rasped, blinking through the haze of pain. You're late. Father Brown stepped forward, untying the ropes carefully. I prefer to arrive when the story is nearly finished. A low chuckle echoed through the warehouse. That's a dangerous philosophy, Father. Father Brown turned. 3 men stood in the shadows, their suits crisp, their faces impassive. The one in the middle stepped forward, adjusting his tie with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who never rushed for anything. Father Brown, he said, smiling like a wolf, I've heard a lot about you, and yet I know so little about you, Father Brown replied, though I suspect your reputation precedes you. The man chuckled. They call me Vincent Moreau, and you've been asking questions about things that don't concern you. Father Brown tilted his head slightly. Truth concerns me, Mr. Moreau, and it seems you've spent quite a bit of effort trying to keep it buried. Moreau's smile didn't waver. Arthur made a mistake. He thought he could sell something that didn't belong to him. Father Brown glanced at Arthur, who had gone very still. The lantern. Moreau's expression darkened just slightly. You know your history, Father. Father Brown nodded. I know that artifacts don't cause greed, Mr. Moreau. They only reveal it. Arthur didn't disappear because of the lantern. He disappeared because he thought he could control the men who wanted it. Moreau stepped closer, his eyes sharp. That's a dangerous assumption. Father Brown smiled faintly. Perhaps, but I suspect you're not afraid of the lantern at all. You're afraid of what happens when its existence becomes public. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. You talk too much, Father, Moreau murmured. And you fear too much, Father Brown replied. Men like you believe you can own everything, objects, people, even history. But greed is a poor master, Mr. Moreau. It takes more than it gives. Moreau's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Arthur let out a low chuckle. He's right, you know. You built your empire on secrets, but secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. Moreau exhaled, shaking his head. It's a shame. You were useful once, Arthur. Father Brown stepped between them. And yet here we are. Moreau studied him for a long moment, then smiled coldly. You win this round, Father. He turned to his men. Let them go. Father Brown helped Arthur to his feet. Moreau watched them leave, his expression unreadable. Outside, the sky had started to lighten. The first hints of dawn breaking through the mist. Arthur let out a shaky breath. You think he's just going to let us walk away? Father Brown shook his head. Number. But I think he understands something now. Arthur frowned. And what's that? Father Brown smiled, faintly. That even in the darkest night, the truth has a way of shining through. They stepped into the street, the city stirring around them. The night had ended, but the story wasn't over. It never was.